Hello, everyone. So let's finish up our discussion of our cardiovascular system. In our last video, we were talking about how there are partial pressures in the air and in the water, and how that affects our ability to bring oxygen or exchange carbon dioxide and other nutrients, but how we pick up oxygen in our lungs or a fish gill or a tracheal system. Now that we've gotten it into the lungs, let's talk about how those partial pressures throughout the body allow us to take oxygen through the body and to pick up carbon dioxide to breathe it back out. So there are partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our body, and it does differ in various parts of the body. And oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to move from where there is a high partial pressure to where there is a low partial pressure. So when the blood comes into the lungs, it has a low partial pressure of oxygen and a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide compared to the alveoli. And so in the alveoli, that oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood and carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the alveoli. So because carbon dioxide has a high partial pressure in the blood, it's going to move towards the alveoli. Because it's low in the blood, oxygen is going to move into the blood. So that allows for within our alveoli of our lungs to then get the oxygen into the blood and get the carbon dioxide out. And then that is going to travel through our blood into the capillaries in our body. And there in our capillaries, the partial pressure is going to favor oxygen moving into the interstitial fluids to be taken to our cells, and carbon dioxide being picked up and put into the blood. And that's all because of that partial pressure wanting to balance out, moving from high to low. If you're feeling a little lost talking about partial pressure, please make sure you have watched that last video, read your textbook, because those are two very good sources to help you understand what we're talking about when we're discussing partial pressure. So we're going to watch a few videos of how carbon dioxide is moving and how oxygen is moving.
Oxygen-poor blood carrying carbon dioxide leaves the tissue capillaries and moves through blood vessels to the heart, where it is pumped to the alveolar capillaries of the lungs. When blood gets to the lungs, hemoglobin gives up its carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. Bicarbonate combines with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, which is then converted back into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cell, out of the blood plasma, and into an alveolus in the lungs, where it is expelled with exhaled air.
Okay, so moving from the blood to the lungs, carbon dioxide is going to move from the blood into the lungs. Feel free to rewind and watch that video again. You can also download your lecture notes and play that PowerPoint or play that video as many times as you'd like. Now let's watch how carbon dioxide is moving from the tissues into the blood.
As carbon dioxide is produced by cellular respiration in the cells, it diffuses into the interstitial fluid, through the capillary wall, and into the blood plasma. Some CO2 remains dissolved in the plasma, but most enters red blood cells. Some CO2 combines with hemoglobin. Most of the carbon dioxide, however, reacts with water to form carbonic acid, H2CO3. Carbonic acid breaks up to form a hydrogen ion, H+, and a bicarbonate ion, HCO3-. Hemoglobin picks up most of the hydrogen ions, preventing them from making the blood too acidic. The bicarbonate ions diffuse out of the red blood cell into the plasma.
Okay, so carbon dioxide that's being made in those body cells, moving into the interstitial fluid, is going to move from our body cells into the capillaries, be picked up by the red blood cells. And then those red blood cells will travel through the capillaries back into veins to the lungs, and that carbon dioxide will be released. Let's look at how oxygen is traveling now. We're going to watch oxygen travel from blood to tissues, and then we're going to see what is happening to get into the blood.
Let's start by looking at the movement of respiratory gases between blood and the body's tissue cells. Oxygen molecules are unloaded from hemoglobin, a protein in red blood cells. Oxygen diffuses into the blood plasma, through the capillary wall, into the interstitial fluid, and into cells, where it is used in cellular respiration.
And then moving from the lungs into the blood.
Meanwhile, oxygen from inhaled air diffuses out of the alveolus into the blood plasma and into the red blood cell, where it combines with hemoglobin. Oxygen-rich blood then leaves the alveolar capillaries and travels to the heart, where it is pumped through blood vessels to tissue capillaries. There, red blood cells deliver oxygen to tissue cells.
Okay, so oxygen moves from the air, it's picked up, we breathe it in, we bring it into the alveoli, into our blood. From the blood, we take it to the body. Carbon dioxide is moving from the body to the capillaries to be exhaled in the lungs. Okay, one more little clip.
Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the two bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. One oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells into the plasma and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs.
Okay. So then when I'm talking about oxygen being transported into the blood, I'm not talking about oxygen just directly floating through by itself. Oxygen and, to a certain extent, carbon dioxide are being carried on respiratory pigments. So respiratory pigments are proteins that transport oxygen, and that allows the blood to carry a lot more oxygen than it would without it. In arthropods and a lot of mollusks, their respiratory pigment is hemocyanin. And hemocyanin has copper as its oxygen binding component. You may have heard like arthropods, like crabs and things, have blood that is a different color. It's slightly different than human blood because that use of hemocyanin with copper. Most vertebrates and even some invertebrates use hemoglobin. That includes what we use. Hemoglobin carries our blood. This is a picture of hemoglobin. You can see it's made of 4 subunits. There's 2 of these more teal subunits, and 2 of these more purpley blue subunits. And in each of those, we have heme. And heme contains iron in it. So rather than copper and hemocyanin, we have iron in hemoglobin. And that's what is going to carry our oxygen. These are carried within erythrocytes. Remember what kind of cell an erythrocyte is? These are within our red blood cells. This is a pigment that is used by almost all vertebrates. They are contained in erythrocytes, and they're a quaternary protein. I think that is all a review from the last page. And each protein subunit has an iron ion containing, or an iron containing heme molecule. So a single molecule of hemoglobin can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. So which of the following reactions prevails in red blood cells traveling through the alveolar capillaries? So what's happening in the alveoli? Is hemoglobin and 4 oxygens combining to make hemoglobin and oxygen together? Is hemoglobin and oxygen breaking up into hemoglobin and oxygen? Are carbon dioxide and water forming H2CO3, this acid? Is H2CO3 breaking up into hydrogen and HCO3? Or are hemoglobin and 4 carbon dioxides combining to make hemoglobin and 4 carbon dioxides combined? About 7% of the carbon dioxide that is released during cellular respiration will end up dissolved in the plasma, in the liquid part of blood. Most of it is going to enter our red blood cells. That RBC means red blood cells, where it'll react with water and form carbonic acid. That has been mentioned a couple of times when we talked about the medulla oblongata, also in those little short video clips that I showed you earlier today. So it will dissociate into hydrogen ions, H+, and bicarbonate. Most of that hydrogen will bind to hemoglobin so that there's not a lot of change in the pH of your blood. You would be in a lot of health crisis if your pH of your blood was changing a lot. Bicarbonate is going to represent about 70% of the carbon dioxide that is transported through the blood, and the rest of it's going to bind to hemoglobin. The rest of that carbon dioxide is going to bind to hemoglobin. Okay, what determines whether oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse into or out of the capillaries in the tissues and near the alveoli? So be able to kind of explain that. All right, we have finally finished this chapter. I know our digestive system chapter and this cardiovascular system chapter are 2 huge chapters with a lot of information to really work on and digest, but please do make sure you're putting in the time. We're still going to talk about our our reproductive system and our nervous system. So we're going to talk about how we make babies and how our brains work. So those are the next few chapters we're going to work on. I'll see you soon. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.